I really like this artistic rendering of the C&O in its early years, which gives you a sense of what they've done, right? So here's the Potomac. This little thing you're seeing here is a ferry that would run across the Potomac. And here is the newly constructed C&O Canal. Again, to transport goods on the C&O Canal was far cheaper than on a wagon on a road. But remember, Harper's Ferry wasn't the end destination. The plan was to get out to the Ohio River. Hopefully, all the way to Pittsburgh. Well, after Harper's Ferry, the C&O hit its big obstacle when it approached this section of the Potomac. And basically they were in an engineering problem where, because of the deal that had been worked out with the B&O and the state of Maryland, the canal had to stay on, the, what's the best way to put it? The northern side of the river, I guess. The interior side, the Maryland side of the river, that's the best way to put it, had to stay on the Maryland side of the river. And here, what would have helped them tremendously was to just cross over to the other side of the river, but weren't allowed to do it, so they had to build a tunnel through this mountain. And this became known as the Paw Paw Tunnel. The initial cost estimate to build the Paw Paw Tunnel was $33,000. You'll notice there's a question mark next to the completion date. We'll come back to the completion date, but I'll tell you the cost now. Remember, the projected cost when it started was $33,000. It wound up costing $616,000. Okay, so obviously this turned the whole project, the continuation of the project, into near disaster for the C&O. And it was just like, I gave you the final cost, but if you were living through it, it was just like, oh, it got extended by another 6 months, the estimate went up. Oh, it got extended by another 6 months, the estimate went up. Like that. Meanwhile, the B&O first constructed a rail line that connected Baltimore and Ellicott's Mills, the place that later becomes Ellicott City, but at this point still called Ellicott's Mills. And so that's the first stretch of the B&O rail line that was completed. And the first railroad cars that operated on that rail line were pulled by horses. The railroad cars sat on tracks and on wheels, but a horse pulled it. Once the horses got the wheels going, they could keep up a really good speed. They could get close to 20 miles an hour. Here's an example of the first one with no engine. And this is a later race between a horse-drawn car and a steam-powered car. So the B&O operates these first railroad cars with horsepower. And then in 1830, they did their first test run with a steam-powered engine. It became referred to in the press as the Tom Thumb. Apparently they didn't call it the Tom Thumb, but the name stuck afterwards. Charles Carroll was on the train. I know that I've said he got dead several times, but in 1830, he was still in the land of the living. And Charles Carroll was on the train, the first steam-powered train, going from Baltimore to Ellicott's Mills, as it reached speeds of 20 miles an hour. And people were screaming, freaking out, holding on tight, terrified. And the speed was not much different than what a horse could do. The difference, that what made people so terrified, is that in their minds, there's nothing pulling the car. It feels like it's just magic. The company switched to steam in 1831. So this was the first test run in 1830, and then they switched from horses to steam after that. They pushed westward, constructing engineering marvels along the way. These incredible bridges and tunnels that, humanity had never constructed anything like them. Again, lots of poorly treated laborers to make all this happen. Irish workers, German workers, and some of this on the C&O too, but more on the B&O, enslaved workers. Sometimes workers tried to get better treatment, and sometimes they were shot at by law enforcement in the pocket of the company. Other times, workers feuded with each other. The working class has a long history of not being united. The B&O got out to Frederick by 1831, and then out to Cumberland by 1842. When the B&O got to Cumberland, the C&O was still stuck working on the Paw Paw Tunnel. Cumberland, now, it's just a huge boom for Cumberland. Remember, already booming because of the National Road. But now, people coming in on the National Road get on this new railroad station in Cumberland and travel from there to Baltimore. So too does all the economic goods, right? The economic goods flow from the west through Cumberland on the National Road and then get loaded onto the trains. This is a historical marker out in Cumberland, talking about the way that the place just takes off after 1842. Also, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company constructed the first telegraph line, which was built from Baltimore to D.C. The telegraph was the beginning of, electrical communication. The telegraph is a little machine that sends electrical impulses. They can be heard if listened to through a wire on the other end. Beep! Beep, beep! The inventor was Samuel Morse, and the code which was used to put the alphabet into electrical beeps became known as Morse code. And in the first telegraph message, Samuel Morse beeped out, "What hath God wrought?" Beeping it from DC to Baltimore. So he beeps it, beep, 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 beep. And someone in Baltimore listens on the other end. They know Morse code. They listen to the beeps. They write down the corresponding letter for each beep. And then they say, he said, "What hath God wrought?" And everybody freaks the F out. Because the borders of time and space have been shattered in a way that you and I will never be able to comprehend. Because our whole lives have been lived with those borders shattered. But for these human beings, all of humanity before this, the only way to get a message from DC to Baltimore was for somebody to bring it. And this was instantaneous. Beep, 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 beep. The only limits to the power of the telegraph, it seemed, were how far humans could string a wire. Gosh, if we could string a wire from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, we could probably communicate instantly all the way across the continent. It's not entirely coincidental that the Mexican War began the same year. Sorry, the Mexican War began 2 years later as the knowledge of the telegraph spread. The United States invaded Mexico and wound up acquiring half of Mexico. Meanwhile, back here in Maryland, the C&O finally made it through the Paw Paw Tunnel and got to Cumberland by 1850. 8 years after the B&O had made it to Cumberland. The Paw Paw Tunnel had almost completely wrecked the C&O company. They were deeply, deeply in debt. And so they announced that they were finished. Remember, the plan had been to go to Pittsburgh, and they had only gotten to Cumberland, and they said, "We did it! We did it! We made it all the way to Cumberland." And they just stopped. So this whole part, which was planned to go from Cumberland up to Pittsburgh, was never constructed. Now, even though the C&O had gotten to Cumberland 8 years after the B&O, once the canal had gotten there, the canal was cheaper than the railroad. So even though they were late, they started to make good money. But the B&O continued to press forward. They made it to the Ohio River in 1852. They would have been there a little sooner, except the state of Pennsylvania wouldn't let them build through this little corner of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania being a jerk, and so they had to swing wide, dipping right around the corner of Pennsylvania, and then hitting the Ohio River at Wheeling, Virginia, which today is Wheeling, West Virginia, but there was no such place as West Virginia. It was part of Virginia. The B&O constructed Camden Station in Baltimore, this massive train station that was a demonstration of the B&O's economic power. It meant that Baltimore became this chugging, clattering, soot-producing city with all the trains coming and going. The switch to coal on the B&O made the trains faster, and of course helped doom future generations of humanity to a climate that would become inhospitable to human life. They were, of course, digging up fossilized matter from millions of years ago and burning it to release the carbon into the atmosphere. But they didn't necessarily understand all that. They were like, look how fast we can go in our choo-choo trains. What could go wrong? The B&O president in 1858 was John Work Garrett. Garrett helped get the position with the maneuvering of wealthy Baltimorean Johns Hopkins. And Garrett turned out to be a savvy, determined corporate president. It's for him, as we'll see later, that Garrett County out in western Maryland gets its name. Garrett will be back in our story in the next lecture, as will the B&O. And by 1860, the B&O had pushed in multiple directions now, with this line connecting Baltimore and D.C., and this line going out to Cumberland, out to Wheeling, and then this other branch going out to Parkersburg, right at the border of Virginia and Ohio. The B&O and the C&O together fueled Maryland's economic growth and development. This graph here is just charting the coal transported on the B&O and the C&O. This is tons of coal each year. And you can see that the B&O eclipses the C&O most of the time. By the time we come back to all this, in the next lecture, the C&O Canal started to decline during the Civil War. And the B&O would continue its growth and development after the Civil War.